Okay, here we go. Part 2 of chapter 20. I'm looking at translating the subjunctive mood and then the optative mood. So, still outside the indicative mood, and so the stress is on translating Greek action kind, not time, which is something that we're not familiar with when bringing it into the English language. So, remember that we're dealing with the aorist, present, or perfect action kind. The aorist representing undefined action kind, the present representing defined action kind, like ongoing action, and the perfect, perfective action kind. And often that translates the same. Notice the key here in English. So we encounter them in very definitive sorts of translation modes. For example, in an independent clause, you can start pretty much a sentence when a subjunctive is used in a way to stress certain tasks. Like you can make it interrogative, like ask something, shall we? Typically, you will see a particular adverb like pothen, pote, or t. Or you can exhort a person. In a narrative, you will see this. Let us do this, let us do that. And it will always be in the plural, like the royal plural. Or command something, even though we have a stronger form of command, which we will see next in chapter 21 in the imperative. And often a command not to do something, to be prohibitive. And we will join that with an aorist. And we will use the may because we're outside the indicative. And then also it's being used as a form of to deny something with a double negative. U may, never. So the only way to really know this is to make a separate card and to be aware of these individual usages. So kind of looking at some examples here. Asking here, this is the example of Pilate in the Passion narrative. What then shall we do with Jesus? From poeo. Notice that that has a sigma there, so it looks like a future indicative in the first singular that will look similar to an aorist subjunctive. Of course, it's outside the indicative, so we don't have an augment. But if you translate it differently, it would be funky. What we shall we do. It just doesn't work. So then you pretty much get the clue here, because you're clued in to the T being used here, that this is a deliberative form of the subjunctive. Or the hortatory, let us go with him, or like in another part of John where it says, let us go with Jesus to die with him, that kind of thing. The mode of command, prohibition. Notice may is being used, not u, because we're outside the indicative. May un verbetete. Do not fear them. Sometimes because it's a prohibition, you can say stop the action. Therefore, stop fearing them. Or the negation. You absolutely never will believe them. You never will believe. Of course, there's also the use of the dependent clause, where one clause depends on the main verb in the other sentence. Or the idea of a noun clause, where we often construct it with the relative pronoun. Notice the rough breathing there, rough little naked endings running around. Often that's being translated as whoever or whatever. A subject clause, where the relative pronoun becomes the subject of the sentence, whoever receives me, and then you see the subjunctive there for the verb, like eitai. A direct object clause, do whatever, and so that will be your form of the accusative, essentially. An adjectival use, an adjectival clause, or an adverb clause. So one would modify the noun, the other one would modify the verb. And it often is the glue of the sentence structure. You could have a purpose clause or a resultant clause. A temporal clause, this idea of time, until, see that, akri, mekri, or concession, if, or if then. So a purpose clause would be in order that, you might know, or in order that this will happen, or so that. You see that in each case there, you will see that the verb carries the subjunctive. See these long vowels. A resultant clause, ina, or hina, as a result. A temporal clause, this one, just this indication of time, whenever, or when, or until, and then the concession, even though. So what about the optative? Well, the only difference there is that you want to give it a little bit more of a contingency, less of a certainty, if you will. So this might happen, or this might be, or what might be. So you give it just a little bit more of ambiguity to it. Sometimes the optative is used in prayers and benedictions. That is kind of like official language. It does not mean that there is doubt. So genatai is often used, genatai, or a form of emi, and a form of didomi. That's a me verb. We haven't really talked about that yet. It comes in the last chapters, 27, 28. And a form of thelo from want or will and echo. That's really all that we have in the New Testament because it was running out of usage. Here's what really comes in handy, and that is we now can use all of the conditional clauses, conditional sentences as we had seen it. We had looked at the indicative at the beginning, especially the true, and then the false in the now sense, but we can now completely fulfill the whole bracket here. Because the outcome is undetermined, the logic is undetermined if you give it some contingency. And now we have two levels of contingencies, a third and a fourth class. If something is possible or something is really remote because the contingency is increased. Let me show you this in a different book here. I like this here. The if clause, the protasis. And the more you increase the assumption toward contingency, you go from the left to the right. You use a subjunctive or an optative. Okay, so now we can use these in the way that we have seen. So we've already seen the first and second, but I like to show you this one table here. Remember, the first was true. Now, if you go to the false, the second class false. If it's determined, may in the negative. We've only seen it with the imperfect. But now that we also have the aorist in the pluperfect, if we find it determined may in the negative, but we have in the protasis an indicative or pluperfect, and then we have a past indicative over here, it could actually be a second conditional sentence that determines false in the past time. And then the third, sometimes you see eon, you would see a subjunctive and an article of contingency, or you'll see an optative. And we really rarely see that optative, and Stevens talks about that. But now you know how that works.